I'm already upset, but here are 10 things, probably more than 10 things that I will bet anything you didn't know about these so-called slave castles in the nation of Ghana. Hi, I'm Angela Sutton. I'm a professor, and I wrote a book on slavery that mostly takes place in these castles and forts in Ghana, and I guarantee you're going to learn something today that you never knew. How can I guarantee it? So you got to think about how we know what we know about the slave trade. The vast majority of documents that were generated in that trade were written by European human traffickers who lived on the coast of West Africa in places like Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, right, all of these places in West Africa. And they were working out of one of these slave castles or slave dungeons. And all the documents of theirs that survived were brought back to Europe, where they were put into the royal archives. These are national archives. They were funded by the nation's royalty, right, at the time, who also funded the trade, the human trafficking trade at the time. So my work focused on two of these companies, the Dutch company and the Prussian company specifically. I also looked at other stuff, but these are the two that are pretty much, they're very neglected in American scholarship, right? Because all of these slave trading documents are on paper still, and they are in boxes that are stored there are miles of boxes of all these letters from slave traders. And when I was in the Netherlands and in Germany doing this research, I got to spend a whole year there. It was my Fulbright year. I got to spend a whole year reading these documents. And what I found when I opened these boxes is that for the vast majority of boxes that I opened, the last person that had opened the box, because it's written on the front, they keep track of these things on the top of every box. So the last person to have opened that box was from the early 1900s, which means that they're no longer with us, which means that I was the only living person who has looked in that box currently, period, like the only one. Now, I realize how nuts this sounds because almost no one knows this about my field, but it's true. Historians of slavery and of the slave trade are working with maybe 5% of the documents that currently exist. So there is lots more to discover, right? And there's just such a high barrier to access because the documents are on paper in Europe in an archaic form of two modern languages that most Americans don't learn. And so I can't even begin to convey to you how much privilege, time, and money it takes to be in the position to be able to spend a year of your life reading and digesting all of this stuff. All that to say, let's first start in West Africa. So you see this area here, right? So that was where Ghana is now. Back then, Europeans called it the Gold Coast because the coast was literally full of these little golden flecks that would gleam in the sun after a rain. But the Europeans mined that all away now. But take a look at this image, right? Every single one of these little flags here represents one of these. A European fort built on African land for the purposes of storage of people and protection from people who didn't agree with your storage of people. So European slave traders were able to rent land from the Africans and build these castles on that land for their nefarious purposes, but it came with a ton of conditions. And how do we know? Because these conditions were spelled out in contracts. And this is one that I photographed in the Netherlands in the National Archives in The Hague. So I need to take a moment to do a little detour about these contracts because I find them fascinating, right? I mean, horrifying. They're horrifying, but also fascinating because a lot of people refer to them as a slave contract, but there's nothing in here about slavery at all. And it wasn't mentioned because it was so obvious that's why Europeans were in Africa that it didn't even have to be spelled out. So instead of it being a slave contract, it was a contract that spelled out the terms of the relationship between the African rulers and the European representatives of the crown, right, of whichever respective monarchy they were trafficking in human beings for. And these contracts read almost like these older European vassalage agreements. So back in the medieval times, a vassalage agreement was an agreement between two civilizations for fealty and protection. So it was like a contract that formalized the relationship between a European ruler, in this case, the 10 men who ran the Dutch West India Company, the Dutch slave trading company, and the king of Akwafu of the African kingdom of Komenda, neither of which actually signed this paper. It was signed through representatives of both parties. And this contract states that Europeans may build a fort or a castle on the land that belongs to the undersigned Africans. You can see right there, there's the signatures or the marks for their signatures. And that the Africans will help provide labor for the fort in exchange for the right to hide in that fort when they are attacked. What? Attacked? What does that mean? Now, who attacked them, right? It was other Africans who were bound by treaty to other Europeans, so the competitors of the Dutch, of the Prussians, of the French, of the Portuguese, of the English, of the Spanish, who were also in the slave trade, right? So Europeans made these vassalage agreements so that they effectively could have standing African militaries that they could use to defend themselves against their European competitors in like a proxy war. If you're a history fan, you'll know that proxy wars became a huge part of how many nations in Africa remained underdeveloped after the end of the colonial era. One could argue, for example, that the genocide in Congo right now was exacerbated by a proxy war between the US and the USSR that took place during the Cold War. Look it up. It's really insane history. Sorry. So back to the contracts, right? So then how did Europeans and Africans come to agreements about the captives sold into American slavery from these slave castles? Well, like with anything, it's complicated. But those people who say things like, oh, they sold their own, are selling you one hell of a racist lie. Let me show you why. So who sold who always depended on power, right? While these early 18th century West Africans were able to demand a lot of flexibility from their European trading partners, outright refusal to trade was not a sustainable option. Coastal African groups that did not have these types of agreements in place with some type of European company usually ended up targeted by Europeans and their African allies for enslavement. Now, because of that, most African leaders in West Africa at the time really only had 4 equally bad options to choose from, right? 1, you cooperate with European traders, but that is dangerous because the more Africans that were taken out of Africa, the fewer were left behind to defend the continent. Number 2, you could pretend to cooperate, but then secretly obstruct the trade as much as possible. That was dangerous because eventually Europeans would catch on. Number 3, you could abandon your home and flee inland. That was dangerous because there were already people living everywhere in West Africa. And if you watch the news, you know that refugees are not always welcome everywhere. Or number 4, they could have resisted and fought, right? And many did actually. But that was also dangerous because it exposed them to the risk of being captured by a more powerful ally of Europeans and then being sold into the trade. And in fact, entire groups of Africans disappeared from the continent in this way. So in this case, it's really important to look at the options that West Africans had available to them, right? People make good choices when they have good choices to make, right? Europeans did not give West Africans that luxury. So how then did the pirates fit into all of this? So remember, the trade was designed to coerce African participation. European slave traders from these official trading companies were in competition with one another, and they fought over access to African trading partners. West Africans, therefore, welcomed pirates, right? Because pirates didn't really have the same kind of power that the royal slave companies did, so they weren't really in a position to coerce Africans in the same way. Right, so I wrote this book about how pirates preyed on the slave trade and forced slave ship sailors and even some African captives into their crews. This harmed the European slave trade in Africa, and it gave Africans another group of competitors to pit against the powerful Europeans. Why? If their European trading partners were busy competing with pirates, they didn't have time to double-cross their African allies. And there was one particularly powerful king, the Ahantan John Kani, who befriended all the pirates and used his relationships with them to take control of one of the slave castles. Fort Great Fredericksburg, that's this one down here. From this castle, King John Kani controlled a significant part of the coastline. Dutch and Prussian slave traders complained about him at length. European slave traders almost didn't make it. We almost saw an end to the slave trade. Until we didn't. But that's a story for another time.